Hello, my name is Neelakantan. I wrote the piece on why the falling fertility rate is not a threat of economic collapse, nor is it a sign of an impending population collapse. Now let's look at where this comes from. If you are to sort of inhabit the subcultures of the internet, you would sort of worry that the falling fertility rate world over is a sign of both these things, that is a population collapse followed by an economic collapse, and the biggest proponent of it is a certain Elon Musk. Now let's see if that's true. First, let's look at whether the population collapse is even mathematically feasible, right? The population of the world, as you know, is about 8 billion. The population of India, and there are certain people in India who actually think that this is a problem for India, the population of India is 1.4 billion people. The fertility rate of the world at this point is about 2.3. The fertility rate of India is at 2. Now, the replacement rate is 2.1, which basically means that India has fallen just below replacement levels, the world is still just above replacement levels, and the population is not under a threat of sort of implosion, so to speak, right? So that out of the way, the other worry that the Elon Musk of the world put forward is that there is an impending economic collapse because of the falling fertility rate. Now, this is a strange argument, right? Because whenever you hear about GDP growth, sometimes what economists would do is sort of adjust it for population, which is another way of saying how we want to measure actual growth is to sort of discount the additional consumption that additional people have brought in and measure real growth. That is what real growth actually is, which is that we want to improve the lives of people and their relative prosperity from their own earlier self, and not measure the overall GDP growth just because there are now more number of people to sort of consume stuff, right? Now, unless you're a billionaire who is sort of profiting from the additional consumption, you will not care for this additional GDP growth. So why is it that people are concerned about this economic collapse when all they mean is slightly fewer number of people basically means that a slightly lower overall GDP growth, but what we really should account for is increased levels of production and prosperity is something that reasonable people don't get and I don't get. The question then becomes, is there no problem at all? Well, there is one problem, which is that a falling fertility rate quite often results in a slightly aging population, which then means that younger people who, at least on a one-time basis, have to support an older generation, right? Now, this brings us to a very important question. What is expanding the life expectancy actually mean? Is it, it raises the question of, is it okay for a society to merely sort of extend the years of one lives but not improve the quality of life, which basically then means that those people become entirely dependent on a younger generation for transfer of resources? Shouldn't we sort of think about expanding life expectancy also as something where we sort of improve the quality of life in those expanded years? This is something that society needs to think about, right? But even if it sort of park that aside, but even if that were not the case, if you were to look at the future and sort of think about sort of either a stabilizing fertility rate or a falling fertility rate, there are examples both inside India and outside. Inside India, the state of Tamil Nadu, for instance, has had a below replacement fertility rate for like over a generation. It still happens to be one of the fastest growing and a relatively prosperous state within the Union. Worldwide, Western Europe, Japan, all these have less, a fertility rate which is significantly, less than the replacement rate, and they are still very, very prosperous places, right? The question to ask then is, if they're still significantly prosperous, why do they constantly keep complaining? Well, the answer to that is, if they really are running out of people to do the jobs that are necessary to be done in their society, they can achieve this in two ways. Take Japan, for instance, right? Like, how has it solved the problem? Japan has essentially solved this problem for the most part by increasing the levels of productivity of its people, like we discussed, and sort of increased automation of said things to do, right? The other way to do that is by immigration. It could, Japan could easily open its doors for immigration, and people from India or, parts of Nigeria or Sudan would just, will be happy to take those jobs. But Japan has not done that for the most part, right? And this sort of points to a very important thing. Either, those jobs which need to be done but are not getting done, either they don't exist, or the society is racist and doesn't want us to go there and do those jobs. Either of those two things are complicated, and whatever the case, it's for that society to judge, right? Now, the real question then becomes, if a society sort of has arrived at the stabilization of its population, and forget Japan, but at least for the rest of the world, has arrived at a certain stabilization of population, what it should really then worry about is to improve and increase the levels of productivity, which will in turn result in increased prosperity, and not worry about, an economic collapse, as, the evidence all across, all around us sort of points to, right? Park that aside. The moment you sort of say that prosperity and economic growth are not in threat, people turn around and say that, giving birth gives our lives meaning, purpose, and joy. So the economist Catherine Packalook, in fact, in her book, argues something to the effect of how, women, particularly women who are highly educated, should have a lot more children. Packalook, for instance, has 14 children. I think 8 of them are her own, 6 of them are her stepchildren, but she encourages all women to have as many children as possible. And reading the book almost makes one wonder, well, this runs counter to every single piece of evidence that there is in the world, which is that the biggest contraceptive known to man is to send a girl child to school. If what she says were true, then women the world over would not be making decision in the opposite direction. The evidence is that with every additional year of education, women tend to have fewer and fewer children, right? So there is that. But to answer the question of purpose, joy, and things thereof, the South African philosopher David Benetta wrote a wonderful book in 2006 called Better Never to Have Been, where he addresses this basic question, which is, well, the way in which we should look at this is the trade-off that we are doing is to the pleasure that is foregone by the unborn child if we were to not give birth to a child, vis-a-vis the pain that the child will certainly endure if the child were to sort of become alive, because like he says, there is no such thing called chronic pleasure, whereas chronic pain is everywhere. In other words, pain is a fact of life, whereas the foregone pleasure is not something that we would worry about. And therefore, if we are going to bring a child to life, then we are certain that there is going to be some pain that we are going to be responsible for in that child's lifetime. And should we be responsible for it is the actual question that he's asking, and he answers that with an affirmative no, in that he's essentially saying that we shouldn't be making that important decision on behalf of the unborn, right? That's one way of looking at it. The other question is, if you're convinced by it, then good for you. If you're not, the next question you're going to ask or put forward, or the argument that you're going to put out is, well, having children is natural, right? Catherine Randall, a Canadian economist and philosopher, again answers this, this in her book, and she says, well, until very recently, what was natural was rape and plunder and murder, and we don't do that anymore in 2024 because human beings have evolved. What is natural is not a good argument to do things, is essentially what she argues, right? Again, good way and a good perspective to look at things, but more importantly, given that it is 2024 and given that we have a stabilizing population, I think reasonable people should ask themselves a different utilitarian question and not look at these philosophical arguments, while you can if you're interested. But the more pressing thing, given the climate change that we are sort of experiencing, is the most carbon expensive thing that you can do in this world is essentially bring a child to life. Because evidence is that that has the highest footprint of all your tasks across life. Now, given that the world is experiencing hurricanes and disasters and earthquakes, hurricanes, cyclones, famines, and the rest, should we be adding to it? is a serious question, right? And given that the world is stabilizing, and given that we are not under particular threat of extinction, should we follow this example of having 14 children per woman? Probably not.